I think the question and debate for Ofgem has been around, do they focus on lowest cost to consumer, or do they say, yes, we need to get on and make some of the investments that are going to be needed to enable zero carbon now? We don't know exactly what those are. Some of those might be wasted. We might end up paying for things that the wrong thing, or having to change direction. And that might put up customer bills a bit, but it means we're more resilient. We're ready. We've got the energy system we need to enable that, to enable zero carbon. Or is it, everything has to be absolutely pinned down? We know exactly where we're going, and balance between hydrogen and the heat or electrification, the exact speed of take up of EVs before we make the investments required. So that's been a key challenge, I think, for Ofgem, is that balance between those, and hopefully that's something that Frances rejoins we can explore with her. Some of you will have seen in the press recently the reaction to one sort of key set of Ofgem decisions, and that's what's known in the trade as RIIO, which is Ofgem's one of key roles, which is controlling the amount that we spend on the energy networks. So 25% of our bill goes to paying for the transmission network, distribution network, and the operation of those. So it's a big chunk. And that money is owned and spent by privatized utilities. And so we are Ofgem's role is there to kind of control that spend and check it. And there were some big announcements last week that we'll come to. Hi, Frances. So good to see you back. Can you hear me okay?
I'm really sorry. Completely disconnected me, and I've had to rejoin all over again. I'm very sorry.
Okay. Well, we've been doing a little bit of background. So everyone will be a little bit more up to some of the key things for Ofgem. We're still having a lot of connection issues there. Still having a lot of connection issues there, Frances. Can't hear you very clearly. Is it? Okay. Let's try once more. And
yeah,
I might suggest you turn your video off, and we just go with a kind of radio style.
Fine. Okay, let's try that. I'm really sorry. I haven't had this issue. I'm right beside the router, and it seems to be working. So I'm really sorry. Shall I turn my video off then?
Should we try that for a bit and see if that helps?
Okay.
Okay. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, and there must be a bandwidth issue at this end, if that's the case.
Yeah, clearly people working hard in London. Okay. Has Ofgem got the balance right between the lowest cost to consumer and cutting and tackling carbon?
Yeah, now that's obviously a very topical question, and absolutely, I think there's a wide range of views on that point, which to be fair. Now, I think what our view is, and I think it is widely shared, is there's two things about net zero. One is the ambition is challenging. There's a lot to get on and be doing. But on the other hand, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about the pathway to net zero. Not just the pathway up to 2050, but even the pathway in the 2020s and 2030s. And that's really been highlighted in the last week by the FES 2020 update. So if you look at, as we've been poring over for the last number of weeks, all the detail behind that modelling, it really shows you there are at least two quite fundamentally different routes to net zero, in particular how it will impact the electricity system. So I think it would be a bit unrealistic to pretend that Ofgem's got a magic ball, as you would say, and be able to predict which of the various routes we're going to be going down towards net zero. And so what we've decided to do is to make RIIO in particular much more dynamic. I mean, I think what people are used to seeing is a 5-year allowance, pretty well locked down, and if firms can deliver the outputs at lower cost, they get to keep a chunk of that and consumers get the rest. We don't think at this particular time that model is going to work, because the risk is, with all the uncertainty, all the policies that are being developed particularly in the coming year, we aren't going to be able to predict what the correct pathway is through to 2026. So we're going to given a significant amount of funding upfront, so £25 billion for electricity transmission in the gas system, and another 10 billion or potentially more to be released as the policies are developed over the coming couple of years. So I know some people are disappointed. They think we're focused a bit too much on driving down cost, but we are actually standing ready to release significant amounts of further investment above that 25 billion. But we want to release it in tranches as the policies guide us towards the correct part of the network, the correct type of investment to unlock net zero.
Okay, that we'll come into Rio in a little bit more detail, Francis, and we can hear you clearly there, so that's great.
Yeah, great.
The if we think about if we think about, say, look back from 2050, and we think about, I know Ofgem's role is protecting consumers and future consumers, and we look back from 2050, and we say, and we think about what people at that time will be thinking about the kind of pathway we did and transition and the effort we put in now. My supposition, I guess, is that at that point, people are not going to be that fussed about whether Ofgem had saved us all 10 quid on our electricity bills, but they're going to be a lot more concerned if they're underwater, to put it kind of in sort of blunt terms. So, and I guess I'm saying that to say that Ofgem has these two things as a balance, as equal, but should surely in that world, we've only got one planet, that has to come first as the top priority. And then given that, we obviously don't want to waste money, we want to do everything in the most efficient way. I guess, does Ofgem is Ofgem still seeing those two things as equal, cost to consumer and the future of the planet, or is it recognizing that the future of the planet is the kind of underlying thing that we have to focus on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we have to, as all government departments, be able to trade off cost and climate change. So obviously everyone, the Treasury puts out guidance on the cost of carbon emissions. So when we're looking at two options, and let's say one would be really inexpensive, but would risk, let's say, the EV rollout and hence decarbonisation of transport, and the other option was more expensive but would help to accelerate the EV rollout and hence bring forward carbon savings, we should be taking the second one if those carbon savings are significant enough. So we have got the toolkit. We don't have to make this up on our own. We have the model. So I think we have said, and we said in the Decarbonisation Action Plan, we are prepared to take greater risk, given the increasing evidence of the scale of the potential harm from climate change. So I think if in doubt, if the evidence is pretty good and pretty solid, and I think we are willing to take more risk. We're not going to wait till everything's absolutely nailed down, and particularly we don't want our decision making to be a barrier to decarbonisation. So we have to be held to account to that commitment that we need to ensure that our arrangements, while prudent, are not a barrier to funding infrastructure needed to address climate change.
Let's look in that a bit more and carry on with the Rio process, which, just for those who don't follow the jargon, is the process of how Ofgem controls does a price control on the cost of the networks and how much that we all have to pay for them in our bills, which, as I say, is about 25% of our electricity bill. And there were some just announcements recently, and I think you've already referred to them, that they didn't cover the electricity distribution networks, but they covered the networks and the electricity transmission networks. And they got a mixed response. I guess it'd be fair to say. You'll be familiar with the Keith Anderson, Chief Exec of Scottish Power, critique, which is gravely at odds with the UK government ambition to accelerate net zero. So given what you've discussed about the balance of risk and not being in the way of zero, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're very familiar. I've obviously seen them in several interviews and in the coverage, and obviously we had a lot of discussions with SSE and all firms in this space who are looking to make some substantial investments. I mean, I think, as I said, we've given a significant amount of upfront funding. Interestingly, of the funding requests which we identified as linked to green investment, our draft proposals fund 90% of that. So when we got the funding proposals in, and you're right, it is all the network companies except electricity distribution, we identify the projects that we think are needed to green energy projects, that's connecting new renewable generation, upgrading the transmission system, enhancing the role of the ESO to balance a zero carbon system. Of those requests, we funded 90% of them. The costs we haven't funded, which of course some network companies are disappointed about, are more about the maintenance and operation of the existing network. So not only did we fund 90% of the projects to facilitate further decarbonisation, we've already also set aside another 10 billion to add on to that. So I think what we're doing is we're being prudent on overfunding operation and maintenance of the existing system, but we've already indicated we'll give them 90% and prepared to give them more on the investment to decarbonise. So I don't think, we're not holding back. Yeah.
Okay, so is the, are there areas, and I think this would be part of the critique from, say, Keith Anson or others, where actually the narrative that there's a lot of uncertainty, I think we all would agree, particularly on heat being the key one.
Yeah.
There are areas where actually there isn't that much uncertainty, is there? I mean, EVs, government has announced it's going to ban fossil fuel cars. The question of the speed of the take up is one that a lot of people debate, but within the two price controls, basically we'll all be driving electric cars. Is that not just an example of where we should just get on, make the investment, and make sure that the network is never, make sure I never have to have the time where I plug in my car and my Leaf sitting outside at the moment. I don't have any problem at the moment, but never a time when I plug it in and network says no.
Okay, that is a very timely question. Later this week, we will be publishing the electricity distribution consultation. So this is the almost second part. So you had the draft determinations for electricity transmission and the gas system. And this week you're getting, because the ED control runs 2 years behind the rest, it starts in 23 rather than 2021. And that exactly is what we've set out. What we've sort of said is there are some areas where there's high degree of uncertainty about the route to net zero, and we want to fund that directly. And then what we want to do is identify where there's less certainty, and that's where we want to target the uncertainty mechanisms. So absolutely, if there's a really clear strategy to decarbonize heat, or a really clear and unambiguous strategy on transportation, there's no reason why that shouldn't get funded right away. That doesn't have to go into an uncertainty mechanism. But we think there will be a range, as you say, and we want the approach to distribution to reflect that range. So watch this space. It's coming out very shortly.
Okay, that's very helpful. This week we can all watch our inboxes. You talk there about reopeners. So we're moving from a world where you just say, right, here's 5 years or 8 years funding, off you go, to a world where you kind of have to apply, reapply as things come clearer. Networks come back to you and say, "Oh, actually, EV growth is a bit quicker here. I need to get on with this a little bit faster," or whatever it is. The heat pump growth perhaps is quicker than we're expecting. Is there a risk that it becomes very slow and bureaucratic? I mean, I guess for yourselves from Ofgem, you're having to now, rather than make a big decision what's time, you're going to every year or have a whole load of proposals coming to you. You're going to have to filter through them. And what we hear back from the networks is that the usual answer is, the default answer from Ofgem will be no. So can you set up that kind of new, fast-moving process? Yeah. Are we going to get stuck in bureaucracy, which will slow down the investment need?
Yeah, so I think absolutely it's a very fair challenge. I think it is, by proposing this approach and by taking that articulated risk, it is incumbent upon us to have those processes in place. And one way we can do that is, one of the things we've done since the publication of the Decarb Action Plan is we've become even more involved with government in terms of shaping policy. So we're now really, together with the OLEV, DFT, BEIS and ourselves, are meeting incredibly regularly. We're completely integrated into the EV policy development process. So it's not going to be an example of a policy coming out and us reacting to it. we as Ofgem will be actually there shaping and informing that policy. We'll probably know about it before it comes out, and we will already be starting to think through what does that mean to the distribution network. So I think if we're in a world where we're just waiting for policy to arrive at us from somewhere else in the government system, we could run into issues. But the only way this is going to work is that Ofgem itself is informing, shaping, and providing the evidence base for the policies from the network, the information we have about networks, testing it, making sure the policy is fit for purpose so we can hit the ground running. But it is, as you say, it's incumbent upon us to deliver this model. If things get slowed down because we can't be agile and efficient, the first people who are going to notice that are the renewables and the flexibility providers and network companies. So we've set ourselves a high bar to not be a blocker to this.
Okay, excellent. We talked about policy development, about central government policy development, but of course we now have a lot of policy development going on at a more local level. 2/3 of local authority with climate emergencies, devolved governments, elected mayors of Greater Manchester and East Midlands and these kind of places all coming up with their own developments and some very ambitious targets. Bristol, net zero by 2030, etc. Is there a risk in this process that a network does its consultation with its local stakeholders and its local democratically elected politician says, this is my target, I need you to deliver the infrastructure so that I can go EV, I can put in all the renewables I want. And then it's Ofgem at the end saying, well, the dead hand of the Whitehall bureaucrat saying, no, sorry, you can't spend that. It's not, you haven't proved your case yet, or it's not for, it's going to be too much cost for consumers. How's it, in this world of much more local activity, how is that dynamic between the sort of local democratic drive towards zero carbon, perhaps quicker than central government policy, and the role of Ofgem as a regulator? How does that tension play out?
Yeah, no, this is one of the absolute key questions, and I'd say one of the most interesting aspects of RIIO-ED2 is we're really moving away from the much more traditional role where each network company goes out and kind of collects the evidence they think is the right evidence to justify their business case, to actually a much more diverse range of local engagement going on, and much richer evidence base, particularly the local area energy plans. So one of the questions we're going to be asking in publication later this week is the work that has been done by the Catapult and the Sustainable Energy Council. Do we think that's should that be established as some sort of a benchmark to say what is a high quality LAP and how should that be used in determining the baselines and the funding for the distribution companies in that region? And particularly, some of the key questions we've got to grapple with and we're seeking views on are, if you've got a democratically elected body and it's proposing to go faster in some areas within its area, and that could lead to network costs which are largely recovered within that democratically defined area, that's much more straightforward. Where there are wider system costs, that's where we really need to get the DNOs through the work they're doing, both in the local area energy plans and local engagement, but also with their distribution phase scenarios, and really knit together those different regional pictures into their DNO business plan. So we are, you'll see in the document coming up this week, we're really focused on this issue. We think there's potentially a huge amount of much richer data coming through. The issue is to try and get that to a solid enough and consistent enough standard that it can be used in setting the DNO allowances. So yeah, a lot of, and we've actually commissioned some work, as you know, in this space ourselves. We're looking at this quite carefully as well.
Okay, just picking up on that issue a little further, Regen published back in the autumn a paper called Energy Networks for the Future. You kindly attended the launch in Liverpool. I think you were going to speak, and then we had hit Purda.
Yes.
There it is for anyone who hasn't seen it.
That's right.
Energy Networks for the Future. And in that, we proposed that there was a kind of statutory role for some sort of local regional body or coalition of bodies that would say, this is what we want to achieve in our area. And that's what the networks would then build to. So it's a similar idea, but perhaps a little bit more established in the process. Can you see that kind of reform coming forward?
So are you saying, so which reform do you mean there? Just which particular reform?
Say is we're talking a lot about a local energy plan, which in an area which the networks can then use as the template to build to. But at the moment, that plan would be advisory. It would have no, there would be no requirement for the networks to take account of that. I guess apart from reporting back to you. No, the final say would stay with Ofgem. I wonder in this world of devolution, where we might be moving to a world where Greater Manchester controls its own NHS budget, maybe it should control the energy infrastructure budget in its locality as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely there's some really, you could start to get into questions about, does some of this get funded through council tax rather than energy bill? I mean, I think there was a recent referendum in one area several months ago, and I actually haven't tracked the outcome, where there was a referendum. So a local authority wanted constituents to vote on their climate emergency plan, but also to indicate whether they'd be willing to pay, I think it was £30 more a year to help fund not the network side of things, because that's obviously for Ofgem, the network companies to decide, but the other, like the charging infrastructure, the heat pumps, etc. So I think some of that's a really interesting development. And there is this question of between general taxation and energy bills and local taxation, what is the best mix to fund more ambitious plan. And I think I think the fact that has actually been put out to a referendum in a local authority area to say, do you want to go faster than national targets, and would you be willing to accept a small uplift on your annual council tax bill to facilitate that? To me, that's a hugely interesting development. I think the issue we've got to be aware of, though, is that we do, at this point in time, we do have a national energy system. We do have 14 DNO regions. We are going to introduce more variation in charges by DNO region. So currently everybody in a single DNO region largely pays the same charge, the same type of charge. We could get more granular. So you could have a situation in an area that is investing more to electrify heat. Maybe they're eligible. So I think greater variation in costs could lead to greater variation in charges over time. So those who want to go further and faster may have to, how much more they're willing to pay.
Bristol wants to go zero carbon by 2030. Clearly, we're not going to have a hydrogen network by then, so it's going to be, I guess, heat networks and heat pumps and energy efficiency. And those heat pumps might require a more expensive network. And there might be, and then the question is who pays and for that kind of going beyond the national target. The paper I referred to sets out some thinking about how that might happen. But you mentioned network charging. So this is a topic I'd also like to spend some time on. It's a extremely complicated one with a lot of jargon. So we'll try and sort of thread our way through it. But if Rio and the price control is how much we pay for networks, network charging is kind of who pays, how it's distributed. So you've been going through a whole process of rethinking that. It's 25% of the bill, and it sends critical signals that affects the business models of everyone who's all 250 participants who are still with us today. We've had an example recently with targeted charging review. I mean, it'd be good to look forward mainly, but if we just cover that quickly, and that perhaps a headline for people on this call particularly was around the removal of embedded benefits, which gave a credit to people who are generating at a distribution level because on the basis they were offsetting demand onto the transmission network, and that those were removed. And that had a significant impact on business model for renewables. And I think talking through that logic is that you came to that is quite useful to understand how Ofgem approaches these things. So the first point I want to ask about that is the principles that you set for the TCR, and I believe they're similar for the significant code review you're currently undergoing, for fairness, proportionality, and reducing distortion. So there was no carbon principle in that process. So if carbon is such an important part of Ofgem's role, wouldn't it be when you're doing key reforms like that, wouldn't putting carbon as the impact on carbon as a key principle you're targeting now makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think in hindsight, we could have done that with TCR, but actually you wouldn't have come to a different outcome, because although carbon wasn't listed as a principle, carbon, the value of carbon emissions, not only did we use the minimum, not the minimum, but we used the carbon emissions value set by BEIS, but we actually went further than that. And in TCR, we ran some sensitivities with even higher carbon prices than set by Treasury to test the fact that if the effect of climate change is even worse than Treasury's estimates say it is, would the policy still make sense? And both under the standard carbon price and the uplifted one, TCR still reduced carbon emissions, and hence there was further savings. So I know we didn't have it on the list, but even if we'd said TCR principle number 4, reduce carbon or accelerate decarbonisation, we would have still made the same decision. So I think it was an unfortunate, from a presentational perspective. In terms of the substance, TCR would have made the same decision. And I know people in individual, the problem with all charging is they affect people in different parts of the country differently. So there's some renewables connectees who would paid less as a result of TCR and some that paid more. So it wasn't universally a policy.
As I am looking through the impact assessment at the time, Francis, there was an acknowledgement that for renewables as a whole, there was a sort of £1 billion plus hit to the business model of renewable generators. And the kind of the logic that Ofgem put into that is it assumed that government would bring in contracts for difference to adjust to maintain the build rate. So the logic, I guess, is that it's using network charges to try and encourage benefit renewables isn't a very efficient policy. It would be much more sensible to support the renewables directly through government policy. Of course, that begs the question of, when you make those changes, does that happen? Does government actually then bring forward more support and subsidy for renewables? So that seems like quite a big assumption. And I think as an investor in renewables, I could see for certain that I'm going to be paying more towards the network. But and maybe I might get some more support from government, although it's not very clear how or when. Then I'm going to be focused on the money that I can see I'm losing, rather than the sort of potential that the government might provide some more support in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the CFD, if you get a CFD contract, you've got 15 years of price support defined by the CFD. No one expects network charges. I mean, I've been sadly involved in network charges for probably close to 2 decades, one form or the other, but they've never stayed still. You look at Project Transmit beforehand. I mean, there's been numerous. I mean, network charging never stands still. I think there must be sort of 20 mods a year on average being implemented. And so in some ways, the certainty you get from a 15-year CM or CFD contract does give you that clear investment certainty. I mean, network charging, you can probably look 5 years ahead and try and make an assessment. But in the case of the embedded benefits, they had been signaled for quite a long time as an aberration. So we were really conscious when we made the TCR decision of saying, look, could someone really have expected these payments to fund renewables for an investable time horizon? And we spoke to a lot of investors and banks, and they sort of said, no, I think everyone accepts they have to go. It's just a matter of whether you do it in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. But what we said, and we did test this with BEIS before making the TCR decision, is that if you remove payments to all small embedded generators and replace those with an extra billion in CFDs, you're still going to save consumers 5 to 6 billion overall. And we did actually go and test that. We didn't just blindly assume that somehow this magical £1 billion would arise. We did make sure, had very in-depth discussions with Treasury and BEIS to test our thinking, and they accepted our thinking on that. So I think I can see, I know there's a lot of disappointment about the TCR. I expect that to go away anytime soon. But genuinely, even if carbon had been a frontline objective, I don't think the decision would have been different. I genuinely don't believe that.
Excellent. Okay, that's a very helpful position. So moving on to the new review, the significant code review. Keeping up with your jargon, everyone. And let's focus in on the access bit. So this is a reform of the access to the network, what rights you have when you connect to the network, and how much it costs you. And thinking of following on the line with renewables and looking at quite a lot of the questions coming in today, there's some the current system is that when you trigger and you pay for your costs of connecting to the network, your sole use assets, but when you trigger reinforcement up the line, then quite a lot of that cost, there's a bit of a complex methodology, but quite a lot of that cost ends up on you. And what that means is that essentially renewables developers go around the country looking for grid capacity rather than suitable sites for renewables. I mean, hopefully they're both, but the first thing is grid capacity. In big areas like mid-Wales with high renewable resources are essentially, there is really no way forward for them to be developed, because there is no way that the any individual project or even the collaboration of 2 or 3 would ever pay for the reinforcement costs. So I know you've been considering moving to what's called shallower charging, where you just pay for your sole use costs rather than some of the costs, and maybe socializing some of those reinforcement costs. That how likely is that?
Yeah, so as you say, I'll just recap really quickly. So basically, there are 2 significant code reviews. One is on the access and forward-looking charges, and by that we mean the part of electricity charges. So electricity network charges are split into 2. Those that send a signal to users about where to connect and how to use the system, and then the residual or top-up charges that then recover the rest of the cost of the network that don't vary with use. So in a sense, they ended up being done slightly backwards. So the TCO is the second bit, the top-up or residual charges, which aren't supposed to drive response. The starting 1 year later, but equally important, is the access and forward-looking charges, SCR, which is a really long mouthful, gets shortened to access, but actually it's got 4 components to it. As you say, what is the connection boundary? So when someone connects to the network and they trigger reinforcement in the network, should they pay that reinforcement or should everybody else pay it? Currently on transmission level, you only pay for your new assets, all the reinforcements paid by everybody. On distribution, you pay your new assets plus a share of that deeper network reinforcement. So a key question we're looking at is, should you shift that a bit and make distribution a bit more like transmission? On the other hand, you've got things on transmission, which make a shallow boundary work quite well, which we are missing on distribution. I mean, I think what we're going to be modeling, what we are modeling and what we're going to be taking forward is a couple of options to move distribution closer to transmission, to reduce some of that, those costs, particularly costs that we think are discouraging connections in areas where it might actually be helpful for decarbonisation to proceed. So I think we're definitely, haven't reached a decision yet, but we're definitely very carefully examining reducing some of those connection charges at the distribution level. But that is only going to work if you get better cost reflective distribution charges. So once you're connected, you then pay a cost reflective charge. So right now, what that deeper connection charge does is it signals to people where it's better for the system to connect. So if you look at, you've got 2 options for connect. One's cheap, one's expensive. The cheap one means there's no network reinforcement required to get you on the system. The expensive one means you've got to reinforce the network for you. Now, you could make them both shallow, but then in the area where you've triggered the reinforcement, your ongoing charges will have to be higher to compensate. So one way or the other, we need to get that signal across. And that is
Lost you for a moment there, Francis. So I think that's very clear. Given the fact that we all know we need a lot more renewables, and given the fact that you mentioned the National Grid Future Energy Scenarios this week, which talk about several gigawatts will be required every year, then this seems like a critical area to hit, that we free up those areas which have been a bit constrained before. I had a question here from Gordon talking about Herefordshire and Shropshire and nothing very much be able to happen because of that. So this feels like a key area to unlock the areas of capacity where there's lots of renewable energy capacity, but the grid is the barrier.
Exactly. And can I just quickly say there are 4 elements to network flexibility. So one is charging. So we've just covered the TCR and the access and forward-looking charging. So that's one. The second is greater network visibility. So currently you can only send signals when you've got the visibility. So currently there's a lot of the lower voltage levels in the system. There's very little network visibility on flows. So one of the things the DNOs want to get, a lot of people support, is better monitoring equipment. So we can actually see what's happening right down at the LV level. Once you have that equipment, which is quite expensive, but it could be very valuable, you can then send even better signals about where that capacity is. So the second element is network visibility and all that data and who gets access to it, who gets to know where the network constraints are and where the network capacity is, and we want that to be as open as possible. The third element is the DSO reform. So the DNOs are busy through the ENA doing a whole set of really ambitious work, all to be delivered by the end of this year, to, in a much more standard way, tender for their requirements and to evaluate flexibility against long-term network builds, not just short-term solutions. And then the fourth and equally important area is the ESO reforms. And the ESO is busy opening up the BM and all the ancillary service markets like Black Start to smaller, more distributed players. And the ESO has to ensure that its big transmission upgrades can be tendered out to things like longer duration batteries. So those 4 elements, charging reforms led by Ofgem, network visibility and data being unlocked through investment in ED1 and ED2 and the data task force recommendations, 3, all the DSO reforms, and 4, the ESO reforms. And finally, the big challenge is how do you make that whole system, that whole ecosystem work together effectively? There's no point having 4 separate sets of things all going in parallel, none of whom connect to each other. So there's a huge coordination challenge that sits with ourselves, with BEIS, with industry, to really make sure that all this stuff is stackable and will bring on that investment, the long-term investment we need in flexible assets and solutions.
Okay, so just to, that's very helpful, Francis. I'm thinking of all those people out there, wanting to connect renewables to the network, not able to do so at the moment, and because of the cost barrier of reinforcement. And you've articulated some of the ways we might address that. But the cost. This is not a question of the Rio process before. This isn't a question where we'll pay for this through price controls. This is a question of how the charging arrangements work and how that works. But at the moment, is there anything to stop a DNO making an investment in an area where they think there'll be lots of renewable applications, and so that they're ready rather than for those connections to come?
Yeah, so currently in ED1, ED1 runs out till April 2023. So there's still a long way to run here. And on that, they still have got funding available to undertake further investment. So there was a question of reopening ED1 partway through and saying, do we need to give them more money to facilitate connection of low carbon technologies and renewables? And the conclusion reached was, no, we don't. They've got the money. So we are definitely, and that's one of the really interesting discussions that we've now engaged in since the COVID pandemic hit, and in the COVID green recovery phase that we're all keen to facilitate. We're now talking to the DNOs about can they bring forward some further investment in the ED1 period to help accelerate some of this. So there's still money there, and we're now actively talking to the DNOs about what can be done.
Okay, just because this question can bounce back and forward. If I talk to a DNO, they'll say, look, we're low risk investments. There's no way we're going to spend few million of our money reinforcing the network in an area on the basis that we think renewables might connect, because that's not what our investors are here for. They're low return, solid returns. So we're never going to. So Ofgem say you could do it, and you've got the money, and the DNO saying yeah, but that's just not our model. That's not our investors. We're never going to make speculative investments because our investors aren't interested in taking that kind of risks. We seem to go around that circle a little bit.
Yeah.
For those outside to know who's right, I guess.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Merlin. So what we have got is something called the ICE, the Incentive on Connection engagement, and it's an annual process, and we're just about to relaunch that. It doesn't hit domestic connections, so it doesn't deal with domestic, but anything outside of domestic. And we're just in the process. I think we've either relaunched or we're about to, and we can penalize the DNOs if they are not providing a responsive connection service. And so if we haven't seen in the last few years when we've run the ICE evidence to suggest a major shortfalling, but we are absolutely looking at this again, and we'll continue to look at this every year. I think what we've seen is some really good improvements in some areas and less consistent across the whole piece. So one of the things we want to do in the run-up to ED2 is to continue to raise the bar and make sure that the funding that is available is being deployed to free up and accelerate connections. So now we're coming out of the really sharp lockdown phase, which unfortunately really stalled the EV rollout. I think we all saw the EV rollout fall off a cliff during the lockdown period, which is really disappointing. But now that that's lifting, and we're seeing potentially the ban on ICE coming forward from 2035 to perhaps something more ambitious, which would be a huge drive to kick off the EV rollout again. And we want the DNOs to be ready to deal with that when it happens. So I know we've had a short slowdown. I know there's been some issues around connections in a few areas during the COVID lockdown period, but everything should be back to business as usual, and we'll take action if we think they're not delivering on connections.
Okay. Another aspect of the SCR is there's been a sort of line in there about shared network charges, and Regen's been very active working on local energy markets. There's a whole government prospering from the energy revolution funding, all sorts of smart local energy approaches where some form of lining up supply and demand at a local level in a smarter way to try and reduce impacts on the network as a whole, as we have lots of more connected at distribution level, more generation, more low carbon technologies. And there's been a kind of a long wish for Ofgem to help this local energy market approach. Is shared network access idea floating there? Is that the answer, or is there something else you might point those who are interested in?
Yeah, so I think whenever people talk about local energy markets, I think there's actually a lot of things that potentially fall under that banner. I don't think there's a single definition of what local energy markets mean. In fact, we did a paper on this a few years ago and came up with about 6 different definitions. But effectively, if you think about it, there is the DNOs, when they're tendering for relieving constraints in their local areas, that creates a local energy market because they're bidding on a very locational basis to just deal with a constraint. So those that can bid into it are by definition local to that constraint. So that is one example of a local energy market. We've also published a consultation on the 20th of July, which on the retail side, which is looking at how can we foster more on innovation in the retail market. And in that, we've set out local supply models where they could consider granting a supply license for a specific geographic area premise. And we've asked stakeholders to come back to us and say, would that be helpful to facilitate local energy markets? That closes on the 12th of October. And we've also said we'll offer a stakeholder engagement event so that people have a chance to come and talk to us. The thing when people talk about local energy trading, sometimes they mean an LMP, locational marginal pricing model, which would be a huge change from the GB market. So currently on the GB market, we balance energy half hourly at a national level. We don't have balancing of energy at DNO or nodal zonal levels. Now, every few years under European legislation, we have to test the GB single market and see whether or not we should split down into zones, perhaps an English, Welsh and Scottish zone, or should we go down to nodes and actually have separate energy markets at each node. Now, every time we've looked at this and assessed the cost of doing it, it hasn't justified, the benefits haven't justified the huge cost to develop it. We continue to look at it. We're probably going to look at it again in the next year or two. But I think right now what we do have is energy is balanced nationally. But what we're looking to do is to facilitate local energy models that allow companies to offer renewable energy directly to their community. There's peer-to-peer trading, but it still all settles back to the nationally balanced markets. So I think whenever people say local energy, you have to be really careful to understand what type of local energy they're talking about.
Just to make sure we understand that just a little bit further, if I'm in my own house behind a meter and I can balance my solar panels and my battery and my EV and my heart's content, and I'm only going to pay for the kind of net. I'm going to only pay all the network costs, etc., on the net amount I use. But if I was doing a deal with my neighbour, then I would essentially be supplying them electricity, and I'd have to pay for all of those costs of, using as if I was using the transmission network, etc. Does that make sense, or is there a more kind of
it does appear at one level logical that you should be able to say, well, I'll just spill a bit of renewable energy at certain periods and my neighbour can use it and we can avoid, but actually that's not really how the system works. And the thing is, the system is balanced by national grid, second by second, and it's always there for you 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, fully balanced, secure system, secured against a black start event, etc., etc. So effectively, when your neighbour is giving you some renewable energy, they're producing some at the same time you're consuming it. But if you started to allow that sort of trading, who's paying to actually keep the whole system balanced? And actually everybody, even if you're consuming energy exported by your neighbour, you're still benefiting from that whole system balancing. So I know it's one of those models that some people think, well, why should we pay? But once you unpick that, then nobody will want to pay for the balancing of the system. And unfortunately, it's a classic public good. It's like streetlights. It's there for everybody all the time. And we think the fair approach is that everybody makes a contribution to that balancing that the national grid offers. And unless people actually go down the microgrid approach, where they actually disconnect from the system and then you could only pay your local asset costs. But if you're connected to the balance system, our view is you should be paying towards it.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We obviously got started a little bit late with connection problems, so I'm proposing just to run on by about 5 minutes.
Yeah. I'm very happy with that.
You're okay with that, Frances, and we'll see how many people we lose. I think it will just be a few more minutes. So just I mentioned that there was a specific proposal around shared network charges, which at a local level. So can you just perhaps explain that briefly for us?
Yeah, so what we'd suggested, what we've taken forward in the access, is if you have two sites that are very proximate to each other. So here we're talking about a factory near a farm, and where you could effectively say, they're so close that effectively you could possibly give them a shared access right, and they could be charged on the basis of sharing that, almost a virtual connection that they're both sharing. So I think our view is probably that can work, but it's only going to be appropriate when you're very proximal, where you could effectively almost put a meter in front of the two properties and move both behind the meter together. And as you were saying, like a household which balances. So I think on a very localized basis, that is definitely something that we're taking forward. But I think the idea of having a community, a wider area of people all effectively acting like their own zone, could only really be facilitated if we went down a local marginal, an LMP or nodal route, because we need consistency. Once you offer it to two households, you have to offer it to every household in the country. So I think that really you'd need to go down to the nodal pricing option for energy markets, which I do think, Dermot Nolan, before he left, did say in his personal opinion, we will probably end up at that point. It will end up an LNP market at some point. I think the big question is when that might happen.
Okay. I think that shared network charging thing will be of interest to people. So, Regen will be flagging out when the consultations come out and the like. But I think that might be an interesting option for people. You mentioned national balancing costs. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly. That's basically the cost of the electricity system operator to keep the system all balanced. And there's been a bit of a narrative around that during COVID, we've seen some very different behaviours that perhaps mimic what we might see in the future with greater renewables on the system, lower demands in certain areas. And that seemed to have led to a increase in the costs of balancing the system. I'm just wondering how Ofgem kind of sees that, if they're concerned that the system balancing costs might going up.
I think that's super relevant. So super relevant question. As you may or may not know, we've had several urgent modifications come forward. There's a live modification on this exact point. So I think that basically what's happened is, unprecedented slowdown in demand, incredibly warm weather at the same time. And what you get a real collapse in system demand. Is what the ESO had to deal with really quickly, was developing some really fast foot-room services. So normally you're trying to think, well, how do we balance the system to deal with a peak in demand? Here we had a situation that you've got nuclear power stations, you've got a lot of kind of base load or renewables that are connected to the system and running whenever it's windy and sunny. What do you do when the demand falls off a cliff? And in a sense, it was a bit of a test case. Some people described this net zero on steroids. Yes, balancing for the forecast for balancing charges is unexpectedly high. And what we're trying to do is trying to reach a view of, in the short term, should some of these higher than usual balancing costs be deferred to a later period. So we had a modification came in. We did accept that any balancing charges above £15 per megawatt hour should be capped out and deferred to a later point. Now another mod's come forward to say, shouldn't that number be even lower? So it is really difficult. We're trying to sort of say, but on the other hand, I think there's been a lot of really useful. I mean, yes, it's been very high and expensive, and I appreciate the effect on some market participants, but it actually has been a really good test case for some of the challenges we need to run a net zero system. And I do think there's a lot of learning that's happened over the last 6 months that will be really useful in ensuring the system can run zero carbon by 2025. So it's been a bit of a rocky road, and we're not finished yet because we've got to decide, do we even defer some more of these BSOAS charges from this summer till later? And that decision will be coming out in the coming weeks.
BSOAS there is another one which is under review as to who ends up paying.
Yes,
future
exactly.
Generators as well as demand customers.
Exactly. So there's the shorter term question, exactly, Merlin, as you say. So in the shorter term, who should pay for these unexpectedly high BSOAS charges this summer with COVID and COVID hitting in the lockdown period? Secondly, the more medium term question is, well, who should pay BSOAS anyhow, and how should they pay it? Currently, it's split between generation and supply. There's some embedded benefits that are being unwound associated with BSOAS. That's trundling along. But we've got the BSOAS task force running, which is being led by the ESO, but obviously with a lot of active Ofgem and industry engagement. And what we're trying to do is to get a more sustainable, stable basis and a fairer basis for recovering BSOAS, because that's a big cost and it's not going away anytime soon.
Excellent. Okay. Francis, I'm conscious of time. I don't want to keep the participants beyond the time we promised. So I think we'll try and bring things towards a close now. We did have one final poll, which is perhaps your report card. I think if I could put it that way, which was about whether that's the I think wrong one we've got up there. We'll hopefully get the right one, which is about whether Ofgem's balancing, whether on Ofgem's balance, and still have the wrong one up there.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Try that one again. The question, hopefully we're about to bring up, was whether Ofgem's got the balance right between decarbonisation and cost. There we go. So has Ofgem got the balance between its pivotal role in the energy sector decarbonising and lowest cost to consumer right? And you have 3 options to vote on.
How do you see that, Merlin? I can't figure out a way to see that.
Is it not coming up for you? It does come up. It comes up on my screen.
I've got the Zoom chat and yourself, that's all. But anyhow, you'll have to tell me what the score is.
Yes, the poll just comes up in front of me. So.
Okay. For some reason it's not.
Obviously, it's some reason.
I've got it. Somebody has helpfully said that panelists can't see polls. Okay, so someone's going to have to tell me how we're doing once the poll's finished.
Excellent. I can see it for some reason. I thought I was a panelist. Anyway, I think that's given people enough time to vote. Rach, you want to reveal the results? So you may not be totally surprised to hear from the audience that there's 80% think you should be focusing more on enabling decarbonisation and about right, and there's 5% thinking more on the lowest cost to consumers. So certainly in this audience, which perhaps is clearly not a representative sample, but a sort of strong group of people active in the energy sector, there's a strong encouragement to Ofgem to continue that thinking a lot about the role of its role and carbon. Okay.
I will just take that as a healthy challenge. I mean, I think we're aware of the challenge, and I think by publishing the Decarbonisation Action Plan, and most importantly, delivering on the Decarbonisation Action Plan, which is obviously the important bit, plus continuing to ensure that our approach to Rio, our approach to network charging, connections, all very much have net zero and climate change at the centre of our decision making. And I do think Jonathan has made that very clear. That is our organisation's big priority. So hopefully, if we ran this poll a year from now, I would hope, Merlin, that number would drop from 80% to something a bit lower. But let's see. Maybe we should rerun. Let's rerun it in a year and see what we get.
Exactly my suggestion. I was going to say, let's have that challenge. Let's rerun this session in a year and see what people think. I think it just remains me to say thank you very much for engaging, taking part, and for giving such full and thoughtful answers, Francis. I think some of the areas that Ofgem cover, it's quite complicated for those not involved in the nitty-gritty and the detail of some of the minutiae of network charging and Rio, but hopefully we've explored how there's some really critical issues and try and unpick some of the big decisions behind it. And hopefully people will take away that there's a lot to play for here. We have a consultation coming out on the settlement for distribution operators. We have all the process of significant code review coming out in charging. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to engage and input. And so hopefully they'll be a little bit better informed to do so.
Great.
Going forward. So, Francis, thank you very much for participating.
Apologies, my video didn't work, but it was. I'm going to invest in some even better kit for the next time.
If anyone's got anyone wants to offer Francis any tips on internet improvement kit, then I'm sure she'd be delighted. So again, thanks very much for Francis. Thank you very much to all of you for participating. Apologies, as Francis said, that we challenged by connection issues, but I think we got there in the end, so that's great. We will be running future sessions of this, but not over August. We'll give ourselves all a break and a bit of time to consider and ponder. It only remains me, as I say, finally to thank you all for attending. I'd normally at this point wish you a safe journey home, but perhaps a safe journey to the kitchen for a cup of tea, and wish you all the best for the summer. Thank you.
Thank you.